Hello everyone, and welcome to another much delayed video essay on an important topic in the field of geoscience. A few years ago, I was reading a paper from 2003 by Dr. Eberhard Frey and colleagues, which described a new species of pterosaur with a large, unusual crest from the Crato Formation in northeastern Brazil. The unusual skull of this pterosaur, then named Tapejara navigans, though now in the genus Tupandactylus, was not the only strange thing about this paper, however. In fact, there's something very strange going on when we look at the discussion of the specimen's origin, and it gets even stranger when we look into Brazil's laws regarding fossil export. You see, this paper may well be an international crime, and one of many, many similar instances with distinctly colonial roots. You see, in Brazil, it's illegal to export fossil material abroad, and it is illegal to work on Brazilian fossil material without involving Brazilian researchers and depositing the material in a Brazilian museum. Peculiarly though, according to the paper, the specimen was deposited in the Staatliches Museum für Naturkunde Karlsruhe in Germany, and none of the authors describing the species were from Brazil. How then could this description and the holding of Tapejara navigans be legal, and is it ethical? More broadly, what effect does taking fossils away from their home countries have on paleontology and science communication in those countries, and to what extent does the practice of illegal or even legal fossil export and description even occur? In this video, we'll be looking at a number of cases of so-called paleontological colonialism, assessing their impact on the field of paleontology and what harm these practices cause to the science in the countries the fossils are being removed from. But first, before we begin, let's define colonialism, and specifically paleontological colonialism. There are many available definitions for the word colonialism, but for the context of this video, I'm going to use the Oxford definition, i.e. that colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. The legacy of colonialism in both paleontology and much more famously and infamously archaeology is one of Western countries exploiting other nations for the knowledge that they can bring the people of the Western nations, and taking their treasures back to be marveled at by the people of the Western countries, at the expense of their country of origin. This practice is often referred to as parachute science, to view these other parts of the world and their cultures as valuable only in the knowledge that they can bring those of us in the Western world. In archaeology, we might think to the British Museum and the countless stolen artifacts that enrich it, enthralling its visitors, but which can no longer benefit the cultures or researchers in the lands from whence they came. However, this same story is true for paleontology. Since its early days, trips to Mongolia and Egypt by European researchers led to the descriptions of countless dinosaur species, all of which were deposited in our Western museums, where they would go widely unknown by the populations of the regions from whence the fossils came. For example, when Henry Fairfield Osborn and Roy Chapman Andrews' expeditions brought back iconic dinosaurs like Velociraptor, Oviraptor, Protoceratops, and the first fossil non-avian dinosaur eggs from Mongolia, with Chapman Andrews' expedition unearthing over 100 dinosaur skeletons, They left the locals with no information on the specimens, no maps for good sites for fossils, and no museum to learn about how their home had changed over the millions of years, and how life had changed and evolved. Instead, they left the land barren of knowledge and stripped of its treasures, to the extent that only now in recent years, thanks to the passionate work of educators and paleontologists like Dr. Balaursatseg Minjin, are the people in Mongolia really starting to learn anything about the iconic creatures that lived where they now stand. Thanks to Dr. Minjin, an institute is now in place for the study and education to the public about Mongolian dinosaurs, and the tide seems to finally be turning in Mongolia, with fossil export laws also now in place. That said, a great deal of so-called parachute science is still occurring in Mongolia, much of this from Russian scientists who are depositing specimens in Moscow museums, as is evident with the very recent description of the Mongolian Alvarez-saurid theropod Ondergervel alifanovi. Ondergervel was not only exported to a Russian museum, but was literally named after the Russian paleontologist Vladimir Alifanov, the man who uncovered and exported the animal back in 1999. One argument that many people, including myself in the past I must confess, might have used in support of removing fossils from so-called third world countries and taking them to Europe, is that, due to Europe's general political stability, they're likely to be safe from uprisings and warfare, and the longer fossils can be kept and studied, well, the better for science. After all, when it comes to archaeology, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was heavily ransacked following the 2011 uprising, so surely it could be argued that it isn't safe to leave fossils in such parts of the world. But there is a flaw to this logic. Beyond just the racist implications of assuming that Europeans are less prone to violence, this simply isn't true if you go back more than a few decades historically, and even now, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, arguing that any fossils in a European museum are automatically safer seems almost laughable, and this attitude has caught paleontology out in a devastating way in the past. To quote a recent paper by PhD student Ubirajara and colleagues, parachute science represents only a small part of this issue. Scientific colonialism also refers to the instances when the expertise of local researchers is devalued and laws within these countries are violated. This disjunct hinders local scientists and domestic scientific development by favoring foreign input and exacerbating power imbalances between those from foreign countries and those located on the ground. Furthermore, this can also lead to mistrust by local scientists towards foreign researchers, affecting future collaborations. The original holotype specimen of Spinosaurus, one of the most famous, mysterious, and fascinating of all the theropod dinosaurs, no longer exists. First described in 1915, it was one of many Egyptian dinosaurs that paleontologist Ernst Stromer's expedition found and had taken back to the Palaeontological Museum, Munich. Unfortunately, when World War II happened, the museum was bombed by the Allies, and all that we had of Spinosaurus, as well as a whole bunch of other prehistoric creatures, got blown to bits. Many of the other species described by Stromer, such as the mysterious Bahariosaurus, are still only known from material that was blown up in World War II. With all the stories from the early days of paleontology, it's easy to assume that these colonial practices of collecting fossils from one part of the world and taking them to the West is a thing of the past, but sadly that couldn't be further from the truth. Here we're going to be looking at some of the more high-profile cases of so-called paleontological colonialism by way of what is referred to as parachute science. First, I'm going to tell you a story about a snake, or a mosasaur relative according to a more recent study, or a dolichosaurid according to another recent study, but whatever the heck it is, enter Tetrapodophis. Tetrapodophis was an unusual small lizard, some 15 centimeters long, preserved in a limestone slab from the early Cretaceous of Brazil, with greatly reduced legs. It's arguably one of the most important fossils in the study of snake evolution, and if not, then it's also potentially important in our understanding of mosasaur evolution. How exactly it came to Germany is unknown, but at some point it arrived in the collection of the Bürgermeister Müller Museum. The export of this fossil was almost certainly illegal, since the museum only opened in 1970, and, to quote the Journal of Paleontological Sciences, by presidential decree in 1942, the Constitution and individual laws of Brazil make all paleontological resources, wherever found within Brazil, property of the state and subject of the laws of the country. Decree number 98,830 of January the 30th, 1990, published in the Official Gazette, Section 1 of March 15, 1990, regulates that the collection of scientific data and materials in Brazil by foreigners, stating that it will be up to the Brazilian institution co-responsible for the scientific cooperation program, referring to the Ministry of Science and Technology, now the Special Secretariat of Science and Technology, but nowhere in any of these decrees does the government define collection permit procedures. It is clear, however, that any fossils brought out of the country without proper customs forms have been done so in violation of Brazil laws. Crikey, that was a long quote. Anyway, when Dr. Dave Martill of the University of Portsmouth found the specimen in the museum's collection, he made no attempt to contact or involve Brazilian researchers, and instead co-authored the formal description of the species with two other European researchers. When Brazilian journalists for the newspaper Estadão asked Martill about the ethics of the illegal fossil exportation, he told them, "I don't give a damn." When asked by the journalist Herton Escobar why he didn't involve any Brazilian researchers, Martill responded,
"But what difference would it make? I mean, do you want me to also have a black person on the team for ethnicity reasons? And a cripple? And a woman? And maybe a homosexual too, just for a bit of all-around balance? If you invite people because they're Brazilian, then people will think that every Brazilian author on a scientific paper is there because he is Brazilian, and not because he is a clever scientist."
Yeah, yikes. And this is despite the fact that there are literally several prominent experts in the evolution and taxonomy of snakes based in Brazil, some of whom he cites in his paper describing the species. In his claim that he wants to work with the best researchers for the job, he's effectively telling these people with decades of experience in the specific field he's publishing in that they aren't as good as white European scientists who aren't specialists in snake evolution. The lack of any interest in repatriating this specimen also means that it's impossible to directly compare new material with what's found in Brazil or anywhere else in South America without these scientists having to fly out to Europe to visit these museums and look at these specimens themselves, with much of the global south giving scientists insufficient funding to make such trips for these kinds of projects. The fact that the specimen is in Europe makes it very difficult to work on for researchers, which may hamper study on legally collected relatives of this species. When paleontologist Dr. Martin Caldwell and colleagues re-evaluated the specimen last year, finding it to be a dolichosaur rather than a snake, they talked about the issues regarding the specimen's provenance, saying,
"Those engaged in scientific research must abide by the laws of the countries where their scientific activities are conducted, and further, they must abide by the ethics guidelines of the relevant scientific societies. An equivalent imperative is that journals publishing scientific works ensure the legality and ethics of the scientific study of the described fossil specimens. To at least meet these standards after the fact, the specimen of Tetrapodophis must be returned to Brazil for curation in a recognized Brazilian paleontological collection."
Throughout their page-long discussion of the ethics regarding the studying of the species, Caldwell et al. Expressed much the same distaste for colonial practices that I do, and actually followed Brazilian law to the best of their abilities, incorporating Brazilian paleontologist Fernando F. Gabaroglio, who actually specializes in the evolution of snakes in their study. In fact, Caldwell et al. Make it quite apparent in this page that due to the laws literally broken in this fossil's export, they wouldn't have worked on the specimen at all if it weren't for the clear errors they found in Martil et al.'s initial analysis. The next case study that we're going to be looking at is Ubirajara jubatus. This is yet another example of an illegally exported animal from the early Cretaceous of Brazil. Ubirajara was a fascinating and feathery member of a group of small Coelurosaurian dinosaurs called the Compsognathids. It was particularly striking due to the 4 long, spear-like, well-preserved display feathers which extended from the animal's shoulder region. I'd love to tell you a lot more about the animal, but I can't, because the paper describing it is gone, and the story behind why said paper is gone is filled with deceit and uncertainty. When Ubirajara was described by paleontologist Robert Smythe and his co-authors, again a European team lacking any Brazilian input, the paper made a curious claim that the fossil was legally exported in 1995, despite the fact that fossil export from Brazil has been effectively illegal since 1943, and deposited again at the Staatliches Museum für Naturkunde Karlsruhe in Germany. This is the same museum as the also probably illegally exported Tapejara navigans, which I talked about at the start of the video. And this paper also included both David Martil and Eberhard Frey as co-authors. Sensing a pattern here? According to an article in Science magazine, Dr. Frey claimed to have had special permission to export the fossil from the Brazilian Department of Minerals and Energy, with the permit from this department being shown to and published by Science magazine. A curious fact about this permit that Frey procured is that the permit claims to only contain limestone and fossils of little to no commercial value. I highly doubt that a unique feathered theropod would be considered to have no commercial value, but anyway, there is a much, much bigger issue here. You see, the real problem is that it looks like this permit itself might be fake. You see, when Science magazine investigated this case, a spokesperson for the Ministry of Science, Research and Art of the Baden-Württemberg state in Germany, that's the organization which runs the museum where Ubirajara was held, told them that they actually received the fossil from a German fossil dealer in 2009 who had imported it to Germany from 2006, not 1995, as Frey had claimed. In fact, the ministry spokesperson directly stated that Dr. Frey was not involved in the illegal export of the fossil at all. If their statement is correct, then that means that Dr. Frey either personally had the fossil smuggled out of the country, or he bought it from people who had, and then lied about how he got it. Again, this is the only way that I can interpret this, but I might be wrong. When Science magazine reporters asked Frey why his account of how the museum got the fossil differed so radically from what the people who actually ran his museum said, according to the writers of the article in Science magazine, he refused to comment. In a 2002 National Geographic article, the Baden-Württemberg Science Ministry said that the 2020 study that described Ubirajara contains demonstrably false information about the date of import of the fossil. This case of parachute science led to pretty much global outrage, with the hashtag Ubirajara belongs to BR, short for Brazil, having thousands of tweets and cool artwork assigned to it on Twitter, following outrage from Brazilian paleontologists that such a unique part of the region's paleontological heritage had been taken. Brazilian paleontologist Dr. Juan Carlos Cisneros gave this interview to DW News regarding the case.
It's not just one dinosaur they are stealing. They're stealing culture, they're stealing money. So these guys are publishing papers, then the museum acquires prestige with that. Then the museum can say, we do a lot of research, good research, and they attract more funding. They attract visitors with this dinosaur in the museum. So it benefits local economy, local culture, local education, and that benefit is not shared with the source with the source country. If you are a curator, if you are willing, if you understand the harm you are causing, and you understand how unethical it is to extract illegally fossils from other countries, you may want to do that. You may want to repatriate. The law doesn't prevent you from doing it.
In a staggering move, the journal Cretaceous Research said that they would no longer allow the publication of papers wherein the fossil material was illegally exported or had ambiguous provenance, and they withdrew the paper. You can no longer find to read the paper describing Ubirajara. While this is a noble stand, I think it's worth noting, however, that it does not extend to parachute science in which fossils were legally exported due to a lack of fossil export laws. Furthermore, other journals from this same publisher Elsevier were publishing articles on fossil material from Kazakhstan that was in a Russian museum, entirely described by Russian co-authors with no Kazakh involvement, or signaled intent to repatriate, as recently as this past July. So Elsevier aren't exactly being consistent here regarding what scale of parachute science they allow or disallow, and it seems plausible that they might only be retracting papers that receive significant negative media attention. Now, I haven't been able to access this article due to a paywall, but according to Twitter users, when asked about the repatriation of the fossil by Brazilian newspaper Folha, Dr. David Martil told them, "We are still an empire. We own Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands, you know." But there is potentially, however, a surprising silver lining to this story. Following extensive outcry and a formal request from Brazil for the repatriation of Ubirajara, with now abundant evidence for Dr. Frey having apparently lied about how the fossil was imported and several laws being broken by the museum, something amazing happened. In July of this year, the cabinet for the German state of Baden-Württemberg voted to approve a proposal from the science minister Theresa Bauer to repatriate the fossil.
Woo! Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for. That's what it's all about. Woo!
Bauer told National Geographic in 2022, "We have a clear stance which is expressed in consistent actions. If there are objects in the collections of our museums that were acquired under legally or ethically unacceptable conditions, a return must be considered. The Ubirajara, in view of its great importance and the questionable circumstances of its acquisition, should therefore be returned to where it belongs, to Brazil." So, at some point in the coming months, the icon of parachute science will hopefully at last return to Brazil. I say hopefully because despite this decision being made in July, it surprisingly hasn't actually happened yet. If it still hasn't happened in a few months, the somewhat positive tone of this segment might retroactively become much less positive. Anyway, while this probable win is of course a rare exception to the norm when it comes to parachute science, it does at least show a change in what actions people are willing to accept. Paleontologist Dr. Aline Giladi, a key organizer in the repatriation campaign, told National Geographic, "With this, we send a powerful message to the world that we want a different science, free from the attitudes of the last century. May a new era of more equitable collaborations open up, in which fair exchanges occur between researchers around the world." Interestingly, Ubirajara was not even the first member of this cool group of feathered theropods, the Compsognathids, to be described from remains illegally exported to the Staatliches Museum für Naturkunde Karlsruhe from Brazil. Enter Mirischia asymmetrica. These remains were first described in 2000, again by doctors Martil and Frey, among others, with the paper describing them giving no indication that the remains were illegally exported. When a later study by these same authors, but led by Dr. Darren Naish, re-evaluated the specimen, they found it to be a Compsognathid and gave it the name Mirischia. Once again, the authors didn't involve any Brazilian researchers. Interestingly, Dr. Naish, whom you may know for his amazing work on Prehistoric Planet alongside a huge amount of genuinely brilliant paleontology work, was at that point in time a PhD student of Dr. Martil, and made it clear on Twitter that his then supervisor didn't tell him that the fossil he was describing was illegally exported. And unlike Ubirajara, this beautiful creature flew under the radar of the media and the online outrage machine. Sadly, it's one of many that will likely never be repatriated. For the next section of the video, I had originally planned on discussing the Brazilian Spinosaurid irritator, which is yet another illegally exported species, worked on by Martil and Frey, and deposited in a German museum, but I'm not going to. Because this problem is much, much bigger than just Brazil, and much, much bigger than David Martil and Eberhard Frey. While these two researchers have consistently found themselves at the receiving end of the discourse regarding colonial practices in paleontology, and, in my opinion, rightly so, there are major systematic issues at play which largely go unreported, because the vast majority of animals and plants paleontologists describe aren't big, flashy, dramatic-looking dinosaurs that capture everyone's attention. They're plants, they're lizards, they're mammals, they're ferns, flowers, beetles, spiders, clams, snails, pollen, spores, diatoms, forams, this kind of thing. The kinds of things that don't get online campaigns for their repatriation. and yet they represent invaluable knowledge about changes to a location's ecosystem and environmental history, and they represent important specimens that could help paleontology be developed as a field in many so-called third world areas. Now, however, I'm going to talk about something flashy again. And that flashy thing is Java Man. The name Java Man refers to type specimens that were used to describe Homo erectus, one of the earliest members of the genus Homo, our own genus, though it was originally placed in its own genus Pithecanthropus. Homo erectus was long considered a so-called missing link in between ape-like and human upright posture, and this species was of paramount importance in our understanding of human evolution. It was uncovered in Java between 1891 and 1892, when the nation was under colonial rule by the Dutch, by a team led by Dutch anatomist Eugene Dubois. Dubois' team included 2 army sergeants and some 50 or so East Indian convict laborers. The team excavated the Solo River at Trinil after Dubois had spent several years with the army in Indonesia, specifically searching for ancient human remains in order to find a so-called missing link. Dubois' team uncovered a tooth, a skull cap, and a thigh bone from sediments between 700,000 and 2 million years in age, which Dubois used to formally describe the species, donating the specimen to the Rijksmuseum van Natuurlijke Historie in Leiden in the Netherlands. So this was one of many cases of classic colonial-era paleontological practice, in which the land the important fossil was found in was deprived of it in a local museum. But if this case was so normal and open and shut for its time, why am I talking about it here? Well, because Java Man, as well as a number of looted historically significant artifacts, has just been requested to be returned to Java in a letter sent to the Dutch culture minister by the Indonesian government. The Javan government argue that both it and a number of archaeological artifacts should be considered looted, and frankly it makes sense that a fossil of such paramount importance should be able to be studied by scientists living and working near the type locality. It's worth noting that this goes beyond just Java Man, as the government requested the return of the entire collection of 40,000 fossils that Dubois and his team collected from Indonesia between 1887 and 1900. This is obviously a huge swath of quaternary paleontological data that's being requested, and I am hopeful, but to be honest, sadly somewhat pessimistic about the possibility of its return. In December, the committee led by lawyer Lilian Gonçalves supposedly reached a decision, though I haven't actually been able to find what the decision was yet, regarding the return of the many fossils, including Java Man. However, my reason for concern about the decision is that, at the time that the material was taken from Indonesia, not only was it done so completely legally, but unlike the historically important human artifacts that Indonesia have also requested to be returned, the fossils weren't directly looted from people who were looking after them. A spokesperson for the Naturalis Museum, where the fossils are being held, told Dutch News that art and natural history objects cannot be put into the same category, adding, "Art is being made by the hand and by locals, but the Java skull would not have been found if Dubois hadn't gone out and looked for it." In short, there is an ongoing argument that paleontological artifacts have less cultural value than the historical and archaeological artifacts. But since the first Homo sapiens to reach Indonesia would have interacted with Homo erectus, this argument probably holds far less weight in this case, if it could even be argued to justify withholding a material taken from a land that you've invaded and occupied against its people's wishes at all, which it can't in my opinion. To make things worse, the same museum spokesperson also told reporters, "We understand the Indonesian claim, but the question remains where the collection can be safely kept and researched. I think I know the answer to that." This claim continues the ideology that I discussed earlier in the video, the flawed notion that fossils are safest in Western Europe. Given the importance of this particular fossil, if we were to role reverse this situation, if you were an American viewer of this video, try to imagine a situation in which the first specimen of T-Rex were discovered by people from Indonesia who took it back with them to their country and then vocally questioned your ability to look after your own fossils. This situation is really no different from that. In this section of the video, we're going to be looking at the effects of paleontological colonialism. The effects of paleontological colonialism were widely discussed by Ubirajara et al. In their recent paper on how colonial practices and economics distort our understanding of deep-time biodiversity. Raja et al. Argue that the practice of parachute science, as well as the exclusion of local researchers from studies involving native specimens, and withholding the specimens from local, often underfunded scientific communities in many parts of the world, hinders local scientists and domestic scientific development by favoring foreign input and exacerbating power imbalances between those from foreign countries and those located near to fossil sites. They also argue that these practices sow distrust between local scientists and international researchers, and given the attitudes that we've seen from people like Martil and Frey, who openly don't seem to care about the development of science in these nations so long as they get to be the ones to describe the cool new fossils, that's frankly completely understandable. The scale of the problem is much larger than media articles on dinosaur controversies would lead you to believe. Due to both colonial practices and greater funding for research available, some 97% of species in the paleobiology database were described by researchers from Western Europe or North America. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the top three were the USA, Germany, and the UK. As visible on this figure from Raja et al. In 2022, there is a distinctively large population of research performed on international specimens that completely lacks local collaboration of any kind, with the majority of British and German co-authored papers describing new taxa from other nations, and roughly half of those involving no local collaborations. The authors note, however, that the proportions on this chart from colonized nations, such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and locations in South America, don't really give a full picture of the scale to which indigenous land rights, where fossils were collected from, were respected, or the degree to which indigenous people were contacted and/or involved in paleontological research. Indeed, Raja et al. Note that in many countries that are territories of other countries, such as Greenland and French Polynesia, indigenous people are often not involved at all in the entire process. Indeed, most experts on African paleofaunas are not based on the continent, with most specimens and studies from many countries being based on work by the specific countries with which they have a colonial history. For example, Raja et al. Found that a quarter of all research conducted in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria was conducted by French researchers. 17% on fossils from Tanzania was conducted by German researchers, and 10% of research on South American and Egyptian fossils was conducted by British researchers. That said, the researchers from these former colonial powers who are willing to engage in parachute science are often just as happy to work on specimens from other parts of the world as they are from their former colonies. One need only look to Dave Martill again, as in his interview with Esterdow, he discussed his belief that all of humanity, irrespective of where you are, should be able to take a fossil back home with them and study it. This willingness to work on material wherever it comes from not only encourages the illegal fossil trade, which deprives many local researchers of potential specimens and hampers the development of paleontology in many nations, but encourages some truly dark practices. For example, Myanmar's amber deposits are world-renowned for their vast collection of extinct life that have been found preserved within them. Yet many of the papers describing the vast diversity of life within these fossils have been described by researchers based outside of their country, despite fossil export being illegal. However, the problem runs far deeper than that. You see, the mines from which the amber is sourced are highly dangerous, narrow shafts that go down up to 100 meters and are typically excavated by teenagers. And as discussed in Ben G. Thomas's excellent video essay that is attached in the description of this video, sadly hundreds of people working in these locations are killed every month trying to collect fossils from them. The area has also been locked in a civil war for some time, with children being forced to fight for both sides. As Ben discusses in his video, amber pieces are smuggled to a market in China where pieces with scientifically important specimens are often sold for hundreds of dollars to tens of thousands of dollars. In areas where the Myanmar army has taken back control, there have been claims that these dangerous mines have been reopened by the army themselves, though these claims are unverified, and it's unclear whether or not purchasing amber by overseas researchers is or is not supporting the horrific human rights abuses that have been occurring in this region. Even if that's not the case, however, the purchase of these fossils is still injecting money into a system that kills hundreds of people every month, if not by supporting the militaries of the area, then by supporting the highly dangerous mining practices that many people are effectively forced into. In a recent letter to the editors of Nature, Ecology and Evolution, Burmese paleontologist Drs. Zin Mong Mong Thane and Kin Zaw argued that there isn't sufficient evidence to argue that money from the sale of amber fossils is being used by the Myanmar military. Intriguingly, they note that while it is illegal to export fossils from Myanmar without a license, it is not technically illegal to export amber, which is considered a gemstone and not a fossil without one. However, legally they should be reported to the Myanmar government, and approval from said government to study the fossil should be granted before any work can continue. Not only does this not seem to have occurred in any high-profile cases, but as the authors note, almost no studies on Myanmar amber has ever involved paleontologists from or based in Myanmar, with little if any repatriation efforts ongoing. Through studying the direct colonial histories of hubs of paleontological research, as well as the socio-economic factors influencing both funding and tools available to paleontological research, as well as rules regarding international collaboration, which in countries such as India make it harder to fund trips for researchers to directly study specimens in foreign collections, Raja et al. Concluded that efforts to mitigate effects of sampling bias to obtain a truly representative view of past biodiversity are dependent upon increasing diversity within the discipline. They argue that spatial sampling biases are borne out not only by geological and physical factors influencing the fossil record, but also by pervasive historical and socio-economic factors. They argue that we thus need to examine these biases more deeply and consider how current research practices in paleontology are hindering efforts to increase diversity across all aspects of our discipline. This is especially crucial if paleontology is to play a part in providing a long-term perspective on the Earth's biodiversity to sustain biodiversity through conservation. They also argue that foreign, i.e. Western, researchers should allow local scientists to lead research trips and lead the write-up of papers on the material described, rather than just participating as co-authors, since this will enable a more level playing field and help to dispel any notion of superiority in Western researchers. They also argue that regional or international funding bodies should ensure long-term funding for paleontological research in countries by providing joint funding schemes for researchers from different countries. Bilateral and multilateral funding partnerships among high and middle or low class income countries and among middle or low income countries that already exist in global health research could be applied to natural sciences. Since fossils are found in the vast majority of countries on Earth, paleontology is an ideal field for the establishment of such schemes by international bodies. However, even in the case of dealing with these issues, we still run into a major systematic problem. Many underprivileged parts of the world simply don't have museums or sufficient funding to keep and look after fossils indefinitely. Such funding schemes could and should be used to establish and help upkeep major knowledge centers and enable the training of local paleontologists. However, we still have an elephant in the room, namely the ability of researchers to access and contribute to the scientific literature. Publishers like Elsevier, Riley, Springer Nature, Taylor and Francis, among others, charge institutions to subscribe to them in order to access the papers they contain. Internationally, publicly funded research should ideally be available for anyone to read, but open access publishing, i.e. publishing of discoveries in ways such that they can be read by anyone who goes on the journal's website, can be prohibitively and shockingly expensive. For example, a couple of years ago, the mega journal Nature announced that they would begin open access publishing, and if you want your paper published open access, you will have to pay the journal as much as €9,500. That's over 16,000 New Zealand dollars. These absurdly expensive practices overwhelmingly lead to a bias towards the global north, where more funding has been made available for publication by researchers and research institutions. There's also the issue that all high-impact scientific journals currently publish in English, and without fluent speakers of the language, papers will either need to be published in local journals, which due to the language barrier are often totally missed by the international scientific community. For a great case study on this happening, check out the original description of the benthic forearm species Elphidium longipontis, aka Elphidium williamsoni, as people then started calling it after it was described a second time, which was originally described in an obscure, hard-to-access Russian language publication and missed by pretty much the entire micropaleontology community for decades as a result. It's clear, therefore, that addressing biases against developing countries and putting an end to colonial practices that benefit researchers from Western institutions requires a major systematic change to the way that publication is performed. It's up to the scientific journals themselves to acknowledge that everyone in the world should have access to science without needing to pay for it, especially when that research was often funded by taxpayer money. That knowledge shouldn't be gatekept by institutions that are able to afford to pay exorbitant fees, because that not only erodes public trust in science, but also erodes the ability of less affluent institutions and citizen scientists from around the world to read, partake in, and contribute to the scientific literature. In their review of the history of scientific colonialism and racism in Western paleontology, Dr. Pedro Mozares and colleagues discuss an example of progress being made to mend Germany's history of parachute science in Tanzania, where the largest mounted skeleton on Earth, from the sauropod Giraffa titan, was uncovered. Here, the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin has been working alongside government officials to provide support for local museum establishment, the training of local paleontologists, and to help with the excavation of specimens. When it comes to addressing colonialistic practices, Monares and his co-authors gave the following considerations that they recommend all paleontologists consider before beginning a paleontological study. Number 1. Am I collecting specimens from indigenous lands? Number 2. Who truly owns the specimens or data I'm using for my research? And number 3. Who might be affected by my research, and what role do they play in the research? They also recommend that scientists consider the demographics of their collaborators and students, and look into who is being left out of the discipline and why that might be. Obviously, there is a lot of progress that hopefully lies ahead of us, as colonial practices are steeped into the history of paleontology. As a micropaleontologist who studies forams, I have to deal with the fact that my discipline's history is deeply intertwined with the history of the fossil fuel industry, who funded micropaleontological biostratigraphy so that they could correlate oil-producing or coal-producing rock layers from place to place. The fossil fuel industry also has a rich history of horrific colonial practices, often occurred on the basis of site selection based on micropaleontology, and are the primary cause of our ongoing climate crisis. We can't argue that as a discipline, paleontology doesn't have blood on its hands. But I believe that progress may be just on the horizon. There has been an explosion of papers covering the effects of colonialism on paleontology over the past few years, with vocal supporters of colonialistic practices, like Dr. David Martill, being increasingly condemned by the international paleontological community, and these specimens seem to finally be being heard by Western researchers. Maybe with further petitioning, we can convince major journals to stop publishing papers on illegally exported specimens, especially when there are no plans to repatriate them or include local researchers. Furthermore, many of the researchers who still engage in colonial practices are now very close to retirement age and starting to be replaced by people who have a better understanding of how these practices both inhibit the development of paleontology as a discipline, the research of scientists in less well-off parts around the world, and skew our understanding of regional biodiversity. The upcoming repatriation of Ubirajara, hopefully at least, sets a precedent of great hope, but similarly, The recent description of Ondergervel, with no obvious controversy, no media outrage, and the paleontological community seemingly not caring, shows that we cannot become complacent. We cannot just assume that things are going to get better just because more loudmouth endorsers of colonial practices are nearing retirement. We need to actively identify and address where colonialist and racist practices are present within our research environments, and then we need to take the reins and steer research in a more inclusive direction. Don't listen to me. Listen to the scientists from the countries that have been plundered by the global north for centuries, and support repatriation of looted specimens. I firmly believe that as a paleontological community, we can make a difference. I've been DJ King, signing off.
Thank you for watching, everyone. If you'd like to support future videos, I now do have a Patreon up, and I can promise, due to the fact that I do now have a new laptop, you can probably tell there's a sharp uptick in audio quality, probably for this point, or at least a change in audio quality, because I'm using a new microphone and a new laptop. Whatever the case, I have now got the ability to spend more time on videos because all of the technical problems that were affecting me before are now at an end. So if you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can get early access to videos, you can get to vote on polls for next videos, you can support my paleo art and get early access to paleo art, and get to vote on future artworks. Really, there's a lot that I think you can get out of it in terms of at least a fun online experience. You can also give one-time donations via my Ko-fi link, which would be very greatly appreciated. I'd also like to put a little shout out to Destin Bogart of Edge and to Henry the Paleo Guy for reading out some quotes during this video. It's always good to try to sort of foster some degree of community among science communication YouTubers, and I'm trying to start doing that with my channel, which I hope will take off, but obviously I don't know. In any case, I hope that you enjoyed this sort of, I guess, fusion of science communication and more sort of breadtubey content. I'm not sure how many future videos will be like this in terms of being more political, but I am thinking of starting a political channel in the future. So if people are interested in that, do comment and let me know. And also, I'd like to quickly thank the amazing Sophie Marie Thirsk and the equally amazing Katie McGregor, aka Moyashi Kiwi, for their wonderful artworks that I've used in this video. Most of the artwork in the video was my own, but there was some of both of theirs. And in any case, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope that we can have many, many adventures across geological time together. Next week, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics in all of geology, foraminifera. And yes, I will make forams fun. After that, I have a few different ideas for videos, but they're going to be a little less biological for a little bit. But there will be more videos coming on dinosaurs and on forams, and we've had a season 2 announcement for Prehistoric Planet. So yes, I absolutely will be bringing out parts 4 and 5 of the Prehistoric Planet review in the coming months. However, they won't be the originally announced part 4, which was going to be about the environments of the series. These are going to be about the episodes, and then the video on the environments of Prehistoric Planet will come out eventually. It'll come out after all of the second season of Prehistoric Planet has been released. Anyway, thanks again for watching. See you guys in the next video.